Madam President, 10 years ago, I gave my maiden speech on the floor of the Senate. I was in a desk right over there on the far side of the chamber. And in the course of that speech, I happened to mention that it was my maiden speech. I had been here about a month, and I went on. I can even remember the subject. It was the deficit, since we were in a unique position that we actually had a surplus in the federal government, and I didn't want to see that surplus piddled away. And we started talking about the budget and what it was necessary to keep the surplus, to utilize the surplus to pay down the national debt over a 10-year period. And so some minutes later, after I had said that this was my maiden speech, all of a sudden those doors right there flung open. And in strode Senator Robert Byrd. And as I am giving this first speech on the floor of the United States Senate, the greatest deliberative body in the world, he comes over to his desk, the one that is draped with black cloth, and upon it sits the vase of flowers to note his passing. And he sat there and he looked at me and he listened to the rest of that oration. And as I concluded, the senator from West Virginia rose and said, "Would the senator from Florida yield?" And I said, "Of course, I yield." And he proceeded off the top of his head from that incredible detailed memory to lay out the history of maiden speeches on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And he had just been back in his office and he had heard in the course of the audio from the television me say that this was my maiden speech, and he came up and went into this long discourse about the importance of maiden speeches and who were the ones that had given them and how long into their service as the new senator they had waited to give them. Later on, as we were debating that budget, the great orator from West Virginia took the floor and he began talking about a tax cut that the Senate was considering, a tax cut that he voted against, and so did this senator from Florida, a tax cut that was ultimately going to take us into deficit financing because it was a tax cut so massive. Instead of a moderate tax cut, of which we could have cut spending, we could have still had a tax cut, and we could have utilized that surplus and paid down the national debt, all of those things. And the senator from West Virginia talked about this tax cut that was going to be a staggering $1.6 trillion. And this is what he said. The great senior senator from West Virginia said, "That is $1,600 for every minute since Jesus Christ was born," Senator Byrd declared. He went on to say, if we go for this big tax cut, that money is gone. End of quote. And what we've seen, since we all like tax cuts, but what we have to do is to have a balance of tax cuts and spending cuts, given the position then that we had a surplus, and how to responsibly use that surplus to pay down the national debt. What we have is a reversal of that. We, of course, have the big, huge deficit because the revenues are not coming in to match the expenditures. And thus, additional problems that have accrued from not listening to the senator who sat in that black draped desk right there. No one else spoke like Senator Byrd or was as original as he was. And so as we mark the passing of our dear colleague, who it's been said many times out here was the longest serving federal lawmaker since the founding of the Republic, now, as we mourn his passing, many will remember the senator from West Virginia by the numbers and by the records that he set. He made history. He brought depth and grace to the United States Senate, and he is forever enshrined as a major part of its history. Now, I can tell you 10 years ago, we freshmen 10 years ago had the blessing of being tutored. No, more than tutored. We were students, we were pupils of the master teacher. He taught us the rules, so important to the conduct of business in this body, but he taught us something more. He taught us decorum. He taught us how to preside as the presiding officer. He taught us that it is respectful, that when you are presiding, you absolutely listen as the presiding officer to the speaker. He taught us so much. He was elected to no fewer than 9 terms. He served first in the House for 6 years. He has cast over 18,000 votes. He presided over both the longest session of the Senate and the shortest. We had no fewer than 12 presidents since he first took office. But the numbers don't tell the full story. Robert Byrd was one of the greatest ever advocates for just plain folks, and especially if they came from West Virginia. He gave them his all after his first and foremost love, his devotion to his wife, Irma. And in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, Robert Byrd always put public service ahead of personal fortune. On my desk in my Senate office, as I would suspect on many other senators' desks, are copies of Senator Byrd's addresses on the history of the Senate. More than 100 of those speeches delivered over a 10-year period. Those are the only books that are set on my personal desk, with bookends of 2 American eagles. That study has been called the most ambitious study of the Senate ever undertaken. And every day, those books remind me of the living history of this institution and its vital role in our democracy. Senator Byrd made rare and noble contributions to his family, his friends, his state, his country, and to this Senate. He was, in a living person, the walking history book of the Senate, which he could recite. And now, as he has gone on to the ages, he will be known as the historian of the Senate. And now, forever for history, he'll be one of the major parts of the United States Senate's history. We mourn his passing. We miss him personally. We grieve for his family. And we are thankful that there was a public servant that surely the Lord would say, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." Mr. President, I yield the floor.